We've got another survey question that we decided to come up with. So if you're ready to tackle this one, the question is, which resistance management case do you think most growers you're familiar with are in? Number one, optimistic, resistance management pays for itself right away. Two, the middle case where resistance management takes a few years to pay for itself. Or number three, the pessimistic case where resistance management takes many years before it pays for itself, if at all. You got 10 seconds. Interesting. That's the way I voted, so it must be right. I was with the government. I was here to help. So. I would not disagree with any of those. I think that's probably pretty close. Okay, to get the afternoon session started, we're fortunate to have Dr. Stephen Powles, who's Director of the Australia Herbicide Resistance Initiative and the University of Western Australia, to talk about global perspective on herbicide resistance. Okay.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, can I also start by thanking David and his team for organising the meeting and inviting me to it. I don't know where that photographer is, but this is my only chance ever to be in the US National Academy of Science. So can that photographer, and I'm going to send it to, tonight, give me it, and I'll email it to my family and tell it I've finally made it into the US Academy of Science, if only for 30 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about herbicide resistance around the world. It is occurring around the world. It is occurring on all continents. It's occurring in many different systems, and it ranges from a minor nuisance to a major problem. And if you come from some part of the world that I'm not mentioning, well, if you come from Australia, you're used to that. So, if you come from India and I say there are no big problems in India, well, there are problems in India. They're regional and specific. There are problems everywhere in the world, but where they are greatest is in the great grain exporting nations of the world. And it's grains that feed the world. It is the big exporting nations, especially Canada, USA, Brazil, Argentina, and Australia, that year in and year out are the big grain exporters for reasons that I'll tell you about. So if I haven't mentioned resistance in Chile or South Africa or Egypt, it's not to say that it's not occurring. Certainly resistance is a problem of the industrialised agricultural nations of the world, for the reasons that are evident here. Resistance occurs around the world where there is minimal diversity, and the most important word that I can say in this presentation is diversity. Diversity is very common, as you all know, in most parts of Asia and Africa, and largely resistance is a minimal problem. Europe has got diversity, and it's only where that diversity has been removed in Europe that resistance is a very significant issue. But in the big five grain exporters, USA, Brazil, Argentina, Canada and Australia, about in that order, they are big farms, they have high reliance on herbicides, labour is expensive, and diversity is low and resistance is high. Now that's basically the picture. Where diversity is high, resistance is low. Where diversity is low, resistance is high. So I now want to just switch and talk to you about two lands where resistance is really a big problem. Now, the first of these lands, let's call it Southland. Now, if you come from Southland, you've got an inferiority complex. There's nothing you can do in Southland that can't be done better in Northland. Northland wins in everything. About the only thing Southland beats Northland in is the size of the great white sharks that's shown there. And if there's time, I'll tell you about that particular real incident. Southland, we're used to everything being bigger and better in Northland, and we said, how can we ever be number one in something in the world? I know we can be number one in herbicide resistance. So what we did, from about 1850 onwards, we covered the south part of Southland with sheep, and they've got to eat something. We had 150 million of them or so, and we planted that nasty resistant-prone weed called lolium from coast to coast when the sheep was king. We imagined taking Palmer amaranth and planting it from coast to coast. That's how smart we are in Southland. We knew our objective. We wanted to be number one in resistance, so when the sheep was king, we seeded lolium and nurtured it across half a continent. It's a genetically diverse species, and of course it's a good feed for pasture for sheep. But in about 1970 onwards, there was no profit anymore in sheep, and farmers switched their emphasis from sheep and pastures to crops. When I say crops, largely only one crop, wheat, in a no-till, no diversity system across millions of acres where we sprayed them with the same herbicide at low rates. We knew our objective, and we achieved it, ladies and gentlemen. We became number one in the world in herbicide resistance. And I'm not hardly showing you any data, but here's a survey, random survey, of Western Southland. And if you can see green on there, that means herbicide susceptible. This is lolium. If it's any colour other than green, it's resistant. Can you see any green? Can you see any red? That is massive resistance, ladies and gentlemen. Those populations that are red are multiple resistant. They are resistant to several herbicides at the same time. They are multiple resistant. I've got a farm sitting in the middle of that, I can tell you, because I have to manage it. I know we manage it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, not only when I say multi-resistant, there are populations there that are simultaneously resistant to most herbicides on Earth. Furthermore, there are populations that are resistant to herbicides which have not yet been discovered. That's the phenomenon of metabolism-based resistance. We have populations that are resistant to a herbicide that is a mere glint in the eye of some herbicide discovery chemist in some company. This is a formidable challenge, and we have achieved our target, number one in the world in herbicide resistance. And we upset Northland. I mean, Northland is used to being number one. So, I mean, Northland said, we can't have Southland, Harold, that's number one in anything. We want to be number one. So how can Northland be number one? I know. We'll cover the country with one herbicide, and we'll achieve our target. So glyphosate-resistant crops were planted, and the same chemical was sprayed everywhere. Cheap, simple weed control, no worries. Now, as you said at the outset, David, we're not pointing fingers. This was an economically rational decision. It just wasn't a biologically rational decision. And so what happened, of course, is the similar phenomenon that played out in Southland. Now, you see that big area? I know it's called various things. It's called the Corn Belt and the Cotton Belt. Well, I've renamed it. What do you think I might call it? the glyphosate belt. Glyphosate wall to wall. And I'm here to report to you that Northland has resumed its rightful place as #1 in the world. And down we go again in Southland, because that is the situation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, obviously I'm being lighthearted about what is very serious matters. Glyphosate is the world's greatest herbicide. It's a 1 in 100-year discovery. It's very likely that there's no one in this room, despite many of you living long lives, that will ever see a herbicide as good as glyphosate. It's up there with penicillin as an aid to humankind. It is essential and important in many parts of the world, and yet it is so good, so cheap, so simple, so easy to overuse. And the loss of glyphosate is something that we should all lament. And yet that is what is facing us. This is what happens if you intervene in an epidemic, whether it's a bacterial infection that you've got or a national or international epidemic. You start to see severity of the disease condition. You intervene, which is the arrow that's on there, and that, for example, it might be taking an antibiotic. You'll still feel sick for a little while, and then you will recover over time. Doesn't matter whether it's the level of the individual or a nation. That's what happens if you intervene in an epidemic. This is what happens if you don't intervene in an epidemic. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are from a part of Northland in which glyphosate still works, do everything you can to intervene, because glyphosate is a 1 in 100-year chemical. There is no doubt in my mind that there are parts of Northland which are past that. And for that, this situation is playing out. And I'm going to make here a very bold prediction. Glyphosate will be driven to redundancy on driver weeds in large parts of Northland. Driver weeds are the weeds on which farmers make their weed control decisions. They're the big weeds that we all know about. And glyphosate will be driven to redundancy. Ladies and gentlemen, and those on the webcast, try to prove that to be wrong. I would love to see that prediction be wrong. I would love to see action taken, and action can still be taken in many parts of Northland, but not all of them, to make that prediction wrong. And if you can influence that decision directly, indirectly, professionally, practically, do what you can, because you'll never see a better herbicide than glyphosate. So what's the response, ladies and gentlemen, of the chemical industry? As we've heard, it's to add pre-emergent herbicides, it's to increase herbicide discovery effort. And you all voted with your clickers. All I would say, Harold, is don't hold your breath for a new herbicide mode of action. And the main thing the chemical industry is doing is adding transgenes for existing herbicides, glufosinate, dicamba, 2,4-D and HPPD herbicides. They are all logical. But there's a but. And the but is that resistance has, can and will occur to these herbicides. After all, 2,4-D is 50 years old, 60 years old, dicamba is 50 years old. There is already resistance out there to these, a substantial resistance in some cases. So how they are used in Northland will be critical to their longevity. And they are not silver bullets. And so what I can see in Northland is that transgenes, and therefore these herbicides, are being added to glyphosate. And that means, of course, that the glyphosate selection intensity is continuing, which is the lack of intervention in an epidemic. So these traits, they're logical. Notice I put that the first word on this slide here. They are logical, these gene traits, but resistance has, can and will evolve. And there is the whiff, well, there's more than a whiff, of the transgenic treadmill in this. And if you can influence to keep that from being a transgenic treadmill in which growers in Northland run through these various gene traits much faster than they could do otherwise, then, ladies and gentlemen, try to influence the farmers in Northland to do this. Now, Harold, I believe this is a really important question. Does there have to be a train wreck in Northland before change will occur? Does there have to be the train wreck before change occurs? Because, as you all know, change is difficult. And I can be very, pending how I'm feeling, pessimistic or optimistic. So this is how I'm feeling when I'm pessimistic about Northland. Firstly, there's a history of successful herbicide weed control that goes back decades. Growers and all those that advise them in Northland are used to excellent weed control whenever they want it. That's what their history is. That's how they feel about it. Changing that culture is difficult. Secondly, there's a very strong belief that new herbicide solutions are imminent. Why would you change if there's a new solution? And that perception is fed by industry, in my view, with strong industry signals of new herbicide and gene solutions. There is short-term, as we've heard today, dollar-driven decision-making. That's pretty much logical. There's a high percentage of rental land in Northland on which one might make different decisions than the farm land that one wants to pass to the next generation. There's an upcoming period of lower grain prices which reduces flexibility, and there are predatory generic herbicide suppliers. Equally, there's a generation of farmers and those that advise them that are used to easy, simple herbicide weed control. And to them, these tactics of diversity can be perceived as too difficult. And growers, this is my own little expression here, this is what I've noticed about growers in Northland, they don't fear the weeds. If you've got multi-resistant lolium over huge areas, including on the land that I've got, that's resistant to herbicides that haven't yet been discovered, you fear the weeds. And at the moment, I don't think. So I want to introduce a new term to you, ladies and gentlemen, and I don't want to trivialise what are extremely serious conditions. We all know about AIDS, SARS and MERS. I want to introduce you to a very virulent condition in Northland. It's widely disseminated in the agricultural community. It's called HOS, or I call it HOS for short. Now, HOS is a condition that's very serious and needs to be overcome in Northland. I want you to just write down what you think HOS is. As soon as I tell you, you'll instantly recognise it. What HOS is. I can see these fertile minds at work. I'm not going to single anybody out. Write it down. Be polite. HOS, a condition to be overcome in the US. You all got it? Herbicide-only syndrome. HOS is alive and virulent in Northland. HOS is the driving paradigm of weed control in US Northland agriculture. HOS is a powerful force, a syndrome which will need to be changed in a world of multi-resistant weeds. But changing it will be difficult, but it will be forced. Because these multiple resistant weeds, whether it's Palmer amaranth or water hemp or any of these other multiple herbicide resistant weeds, are telling us that herbicides alone are not sustainable. And fortune favours the prepared mind, and diversity is the only way forward in a world of multiple resistant weeds. And don't get depressed. It's entirely manageable. It starts by accepting HOS exists. We would not in Southland be producing crops if we hadn't had to overcome HOS. It's entirely possible, and it starts by realising that herbicides are a superb weed control tool, but not without diversity. And as soon as diversity starts to be introduced, then herbicides can be much more sustainable. If HOS is replaced by diversity, herbicides can be much more sustainable in Northland, and Northland can lose its status as number one in the world in herbicide-resistant weeds. And I know there's not a lot of time left. This simple sentence should be the foundation on which we devise pest management practices, whether it is antibiotic use in humans, anti-cancer drugs in humans, insecticides, fungicides, herbicides. Diversity disrupts resistance evolution. If we practice that one sentence, of course it's diversity within economic reality, but diversity disrupts resistance evolution. And it is a combination of herbicides and non-herbicide tools that make economic sense within a farming system. I'm not going to go into it because Mike Owen will be going into more details. It involves, of course, excellent agronomy. It involves understanding the biology of the species that you're dealing with, to look for weaknesses in their biology that can be exploited. And of course it is new tools, both herbicides and non-herbicide tools. And in the short few minutes that are left, it's not possible for me to go through what all of those diversity tactics are. They will differ. What represents economically viable diversity for a Nebraska farmer will not be the same as for a Thai cotton farmer or a Southland wheat grower. But sustainable systems in any of those will involve the principles of diversity, combination of agronomy, understanding of the biology of the organisms, and employing all the tools, including herbicides. And those of you from the herbicide discovery corporations, we need synergists, we need safeners, we need non-metabolizable new herbicides, we need smarter use of full doses and mixtures and sequences, we need RNAi if it can come along, and most of all, we need herbicide restraint to use these fabulous tools when we most need them within what is well known as an IPM strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, it can work. If it didn't work, we wouldn't be producing crops in Southland. It can work. Let me finish up with just one example. This is what happens in Southland when we harvest crops. Same thing happens in Northland, doesn't it? What we do is we harvest the grain, and everything that's not the grain we disseminate out the back of the combine harvester, including all the weed seeds that we've harvested. And we evenly spread them out in the field so that they'll generate next year, and we can come up with herbicide-only solutions to them. Well, after doing this for a number of years in Australia and in Southland and running into major multi-resistance problems, it finally dawned on us as a community that this wasn't a very smart practice. It also dawned on us that there was an opportunity, and that opportunity we call harvest weed seed control. Now in that photograph you see a combine harvester. That is a windrowed field of Roundup Ready canola, very close to where my farm is, and that towed behind is what could be described as a chaff cart. It intercepts the chaff fraction, which contains the seed of our two most multi-resistant weed species, Lolium and Raphanus, which have a biological weakness in that they remain intact and attached on the plant at the time of harvest. And that machine and other techniques of harvest weed seed control are a wonderful way of helping herbicide sustainability and have allowed growers in Southland to bring multi-resistant weed populations to very low levels. Now, is this going to come into Northland agriculture? You watch this technique and other techniques, largely driven by farmers, occur as creative solutions are found to overcome and battle multiple resistance. Jason Norsworthy at the University of Arkansas has constructed one of these machines and is testing it. Jason tells me that 99% of Palmer amaranth seed can be captured and destroyed in this machine. Just as that 99% non-chemically. What a magnificent aid to herbicides, Jason. What a great aid. And I know what you're thinking right now, all you evolutionary biologists. Well, the weeds can evolve resistance to that. Of course they can. That's why we need diversity. Diversity means using every technique that's available to you that makes economic sense. Jason, you've got a big job to do with that machine. There's another one that we've got called the Harrington Seed Destructor. A farmer innovation, a grower innovation. This machine is now commercially available. It destroys the weed seed in the, out of the back of the combine harvester. One of these machines is coming into Canada. One of them's coming into northern parts of Northland. And you watch creative solutions come. So we've no need to get depressed. What we need to do is react to herbicide resistance. So, ladies and gentlemen, will diversity replace HOS anytime soon in Northland? The answer is yes, because it'll be driven by multiple resistant weeds. Multiple herbicide resistant weeds will force change in Northland. And as has been said today, there's a strong role for everybody in this. Jason, I would have thought that agroecologists and weed ecologists felt pretty lonely the last 15 years. They're going to have their place in the sun as they work out what the biology of these species, the weaknesses are that can be exploited. There's a role for agronomists. There's a role for advisors. There's definitely a role for growers. They need to come on board on some of these things. Scientists, including social science economists, definitely a role for communicators. And government, there's a role for government. I've noticed since being here, contrary to my instincts, that I'm forced to drive on the right-hand side of the road. I think government decided that that would be the case. In fact, when I drive on the left-hand side of the road, it causes all sorts of chaos. So are we used to government having a role? Of course there's a role for government in this. Is it an abnormally large role? No, but is there a role for government? Did you know that we've had mandatory government-mandated mode of action labelling for 20 years in Australia? Southland? Northland needs to consider what it's going to do. And in big capitals, there's a big role from industry. Industry needs to get onto this in the absence of new herbicides. In the absence of new herbicides, industry better get on board or else they won't have any herbicides because they'll be driven to resistance. So industry's got a big role to play positively. And it involves all these things we're talking about. These are some of the things that we're doing in Southland: understand the biology, modelling the dollars, bioeconomic modelling, seed banks, resistance champion farmers, mode of action labelling, multidisciplinary, all those sorts of things. They're all going to come. I've only got 2 slides left. My conclusions, Harold. The future, herbicide-resistant weeds are a huge challenge to world food security because they are occurring in the great grain exporting nations of the world, especially Northland, which is the world's greatest grain exporter. And I mean, when I've said grain, if you're from the cotton industry, don't feel left out. I'm talking about cotton as well, field crops. And thus, herbicide resistance, multiple resistance across many herbicides, is a threat to global food security. To overcome it needs brains and diversity, and especially, but not exclusively, herbicides. So I've written a poem for you. I was going to sing it for you, but I'll save you that excruciating experience. But I've written a poem for you in Northland. Would you like to see it? It's called The Ode to Diversity. Americans all, Northland. Americans all, let us rejoice, for we are proud and free. We've golden soil and crops for toil, and now we've got diversity. Resistant weeds will not be our fate. Crops, chemicals and tools we will rotate. Thus in joyful strains, let us plea, long live diversity. The key word is diversity, and the time for diversity in Northland is now. Thank you.
George, your timing is impeccable. So we're ready for our next presentation, entitled Diversifying Weed Management Tactics. Dr. Michael Owen, is it?
It could be.
University professor and extension weed scientist from Iowa State University. I understand you're new to this issue. Is that correct?
It is.
All right.
I'm a rookie.